So we will be spending our time in Luke chapter 2, verses 1 to 7. So if you want to turn there, and we will unpack it together as we move through this passage. So Luke chapter 2, verses 1 to 7. Now I want you to imagine two armies facing off. These armies, there's one on one side of the river or the creek or wherever it is that they're set up, and battle lines have been drawn. Here's an oppressor who has been taking ground steadily for a while now, and on the other side is this tired, discouraged, beat up remnants of a once powerful army, battered and dented armor, and horses that are tired and hungry, and soldiers anxious and weary and feeling beat up. And their flags, even that they hold, seem to be tattered. And the wind just doesn't seem to pick up their flags because they're so discouraged. But they have no choice but to make a last stand. So they position themselves for an attack. Meanwhile, the strength of the conquerors and the smell of victory in the nostrils fills the other side with courage, knowing that victory is imminent. And their flags seem to even be flying proudly, and their armor seems to be shiny and bright. But maybe they're a little bit too sure of themselves, because instead of attacking as an army, as a joined force, what they do is they send out their best fighter to challenge them to single combat. And I think it's a little bit cocky for them to do that. And this is where the story shows the kid, a shepherd boy by the name of David, comes and he pushes himself through the crowd, and he comes and he stands before this giant Goliath with nothing more than a sling and a stone. And he defeats the giant Goliath, eventually becoming King David. You could call him David the giant slayer. It's now, imagine, 1,000 years later, and the better David has arrived. Who could have thought there would ever been a greater David than this giant slayer? Yet here he is. He has arrived, and he will establish his eternal kingdom in spite of bigger, badder, meaner giants in the world. The greatest event in the history of mankind was the coming of Jesus into this world in body and flesh to carry out his redemptive mission. In fact, many centuries earlier, even before King David, the Old Testament prophets had predicted that one day the Messiah would be born. One day he's going to come. Finally, the time has arrived. And the first thing that we see in this arrival of the Messiah is that it was an historic birth. This was history in the making. Let's read verses 1 to 3. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that the whole empire should be registered. This first registration took place while Quirinius was governing Syria. So everyone went to be registered, each to his own town. Now, every once in a while, somebody will come up to me, maybe they've come up to you, and maybe you've even been guilty of saying this yourself, that this stuff's just all made up. That the Luke narrative is just a way to convince the already convinced. That the real truth is that these are just lies, or they're myths, or maybe they're a combination, or at the very least, embellished. But the truth is that the vast majority of Christians, and for that matter, non-Christian historical historians, all agree that here in this account are definite historical circumstances surrounding Jesus' birth and entrance into human history that can't be denied or thrown away as lies. There is just too much evidence to do that in good conscience. And so a good, solid historian would not do that. In fact, much of these same events are recorded in extra-biblical literature. Luke is even known as one of the great historians in the world, not just out in the Bible, but in the world and in academia, even today. And what Luke is describing as an historian, with the inspiration of the Holy Spirit combined, what he's doing is describing real historical circumstances surrounding Jesus' birth, stuff that was actually going on. It's like reading a newspaper of the day. And he starts off by giving us a specific action by a specific Caesar that all historians agree on, and about a Caesar and a specific action that everyone at the time of this writing would have known and experienced themselves. So Luke couldn't have manipulated the details even if he had wanted to. So, Let's ask the question. What happened that Luke then recorded in an historical document for us? So what happened was that Caesar Augustus issued a decree for a census. Why? To compile a list of property owners for the purpose of collecting taxes and for the purpose of military registration. It was a thoroughly secular decree, the kind of thing that governments have been doing since the beginning of time. So it's normal. And yet what we see is that God was using this act in a most amazing way, as we're going to be able to see. Now, Caesar's name, this is Caesar here. His name, when he was born, was Gaius Octavius. Later on, he became and is often referred to as Octavian. Gaius Octavian was born in the year 63 BC. He didn't know that at the time because Jesus hadn't been born. So how do you go BC to... Anyways, don't worry about that. So he was born... Some of you caught that. He was born in the year 63 BC, and his mother's name was Attia. Now, that's important that we know this, and here's why. Attia, his mother, was the daughter of Julia. Who's Julia? Julia was the sister of Julius Caesar. Start to see these connections here. So that made Octavian the grandnephew of Julius Caesar. In other words, this guy is born in high places. He's born somewhat with a silver spoon in his mouth, you could say. Now, for whatever reason, Julius Caesar took a tremendous shine to this boy. He had other nephews, but he took a shine to Octavian. And eventually he adopted him when Gaius had reached the age of 20. And he declared him at that time to be the heir to the throne of the Roman Empire. There's still a few hoops that he had to jump through, but that was what he was declared. However, 1 year later, Julius Caesar was murdered. And that made then Octavian the emperor of the Roman Empire. At that point, he changed his name to Gaius Julius Caesar in honor of his great-uncle Julius Caesar. Meanwhile, one of Octavian's sisters, again, follow this line here, married a guy by the name of Mark Antony. And so some of you might know who Mark Antony was. He was a very dominant figure in Roman history. So here he was, the grandnephew of Julius Caesar, adopted as a son and heir, and his sister is married to Mark Antony, who was a powerful person. So this is really looking good for Octavian at this point. At the death of Julius Caesar, they had learned their lesson because Julius Caesar had been a dictator. And so what they did was they put 3 guys in power at the same time. So they had a guy named Lepidus, who was reigning along with Mark Antony, and they brought in Octavian. So there was the 3 of them leading the empire. However, it wasn't long before, for whatever reasons, I won't get into it all, but Lepidus fell out, and the rule of Rome was left with Octavian and Mark Antony. They ruled together for quite a while until Mark Antony began to do some things that really bugged Octavian. First thing he did was that he left his wife. Mark Antony left his wife. Now remember that Mark Antony's wife was the sister of Octavian. Remember that? Octavian didn't think that was too cool. Didn't like that very much. Now the reason that Mark Antony left his wife was because he had become infatuated with the legendary and bewitching, do you know who? Cleopatra. He joined up with her. She was the queen of Egypt, and apparently she had bewitched him enough so that he began to show more concern for Egypt and more concern for the successes of Cleopatra and more concern for her personally and for his own welfare than he did for Rome, and that wasn't a good thing. So, Octavian got, as we probably would suspect, pretty upset. Like really, really upset. So upset, in fact, that he faced off Mark Antony and Cleopatra in a naval battle. A battle that the Egyptians, by the way, should never have gotten themselves involved in because the Egyptian Navy was soundly defeated and absolutely destroyed. They were never able to raise their naval fleet again. Octavian literally destroyed the Egyptian fleet, the power of Mark Antony, and the rule of Cleopatra, and he became at that point the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. Both Mark Antony and Cleopatra soon after that committed suicide together, and Octavian was left to rule without any challenge to the throne. And soon afterwards, he took on the name Augustus. And the name Augustus means, basically elevates him like a god. He was everything and a bag of chips. I mean, he was everything. So now, for 45 years, he rules the Roman Empire. And he is probably considered the greatest Roman Empire that the Roman Empire ever had. There's not much argument there. He was a remarkable man. And he was the absolute ruler of this empire. And because he had great military skill, he had great political savvy, he was very popular with the masses. He had this great social skill, even with the senators. He was able to put an end to all the civil wars that they had been dealing with and having to put up with and throughout the years previous. And so it allowed them to expand their empire. There's a reason why I'm telling you all of this, so hang on tightly. He was able to, because of all of that, to be able to expand his empire all the way from the west, all the way to deep into the Middle East, as far away as the deserts in Iraq. I mean, this was huge. This was a big area, vastly dominating the entire inhabited, known world at the time. And in doing so, what happened was he was able to bring a peace the world hadn't known before. In fact, to this day, it's called the Pax Romana, or the Peace of Rome. And given that he had also built these massive Roman roads, he had started in the social infrastructure development phase, and he created these fantastic, effective transportation systems in all directions. The reason they say all roads lead to Rome is out of his day, because all roads literally led to Rome. And this was done throughout all of the Roman Empire. Now, you tie that kind of thing in with this Pax Romana, this peace, and it facilitated the rapid spread of the gospel. You can see that later on. In other words, it was perfect timing. In Galatians 4:4, it says, "In the fullness of time, God sent his son." One of the elements of the fullness of time was into a world where you had the most rapid, easy access to take the gospel everywhere. And because Rome controlled it all, there would have been no borders. There was ease and access. And the gospel spread rapidly, largely along the Roman roads and the Roman trade routes by sea and by land. And you can read that in the book of Acts and see Paul's missionary journeys and how he was able to access throughout the whole Roman Empire with the gospel of Jesus Christ. See, the Pax Romana brought an unheard of period of peace at the hand of this great leader. And here's the thing. It was this specific Caesar who made the specific word and call for the world to be taxed. And what this tax required, or the census required, was for the Jews to travel back to their ancestral city or their village or their town to be registered. And it's important, I think, to take note of this, because Mary's about to give birth. And she's not in Bethlehem at this moment in time where Jesus is supposed to be born. They have to get to Bethlehem. But there's no other reason for her to get to Bethlehem, because they're in Nazareth. That's their home. But Rome at that time, they think that they're flexing their muscles, their might, their power. But God was the one in control of it all. God was the one in control of history. God was using this decree for his purposes, to accomplish his purposes. Micah 5:2 promises that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. It reads this way: "But you, O Bethlehem, Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days." Listen, if Mary gave birth anywhere else but Bethlehem, then Jesus couldn't be the Messiah. Listen, church, the point is that this was a historical narrative. It's not a myth. It's about real lives living in a real chaotic world, and yet God was showing them and us that he was fully in control. He was the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. God never, ever plays catch up to the decisions being made by the giants in the world at any time in history. He has never done that. Caesar, like Cyrus before him, and Nebuchadnezzar, who God called my servant, all of them unknowingly became the servant of God's purposes. The promise is fulfilled through the actions, church, of the unlikeliest of people. The point is this: God is sovereign over all. So, what we have here are historical circumstances surrounding Jesus' birth. He was born in real time, just like each one of us. God moved the heart of Caesar to issue that decree so that Jesus would be born in his prophesied birthplace. You see, God was using history for his story. And he's the very same God here today. It's not a different God that we read about in the Old Testament. It's not a different God that we read about in the New Testament. It's the very same God that is here today in Cole Harbor in the year 2024. And yeah, the world is still chaotic. Just read a newspaper. That'll tell you that. And oftentimes, we can feel small and we can feel helpless. We feel like we're facing giants, whatever those giants might be, giant problems, giant addictions, giant bills, giant health issues, giant mental issues. And we might not even like what the governments are doing or not doing. We might not like what our boss is doing or not doing. We may feel like our world's out of control and we just can't stop that merry-go-round to get off. You ever feel that way? But here's what I want you to remember: that God, the God of history, is still the sovereign God who's in control and who is working things out for our good. We read that in Romans 8:28. We know that all things work together for the good of those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. This was a historic birth because God is sovereign over history. But not only was it a historic birth, it was also a messianic birth. Look at verses 4-5. Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family line of David, to be registered along with Mary, who was engaged to him and was pregnant. You know, I find it interesting that Luke emphasizes this whole messianic theme in describing their journey, even as they're just heading off to Bethlehem. They went to what? The city of what? David. And here it says Joseph was of the house and family line of David. Let's try that again. I heard three of you. They went to the house and family line of David. Yeah, that's where he went. This is a messianic theme. Actually, Mary, by the way, was part of the lineage of David too. She was of the line of David, but that's talked about in Matthew's gospel account. But why would Luke point this out? For that matter, why would Matthew point it out about Mary? It's because somewhere down the line, Joseph and Mary are related to David. That's important. Now, remember at the very beginning we talked about that boy that pushed himself through the crowd and beat the giant. His name was David. He became the king. He was known as Israel's greatest king. And for those who knew the Old Testament, they would have known that the Messiah was prophesied to come from David's family tree. The Messiah would be the seed of David. He would be then literally one of David's descendants. Listen to Isaiah 9. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. If anybody argues with you that Jesus is not God, go to this verse here. He will be called the Mighty God, talking to Jesus, and he will be part of the throne of David. Now, for centuries, God's covenant people look forward to a promised coming Messiah. David's greater offspring. We sung about that already earlier. Now, specifically, in David's day, they longed for a deliverer from the Philistines. That's who that giant Goliath was part of. He was part of the people group of Philistines. 3 centuries later, Isaiah's generation wanted to be rescued from the Assyrians. 2 centuries more, in Jeremiah's generation ached for release from Babylon. In Jesus' day, the Jews were longing for release from this heavy Roman hand that they were living under, even as their forefathers had groaned for freedom from Egypt as slaves of the Pharaoh. Yet under it all was a greater dominion and slavery. It was a slavery to sin. That's what they needed to be freed from. And by the way, this Messiah couldn't just be anybody. Couldn't be just somebody who says, hey, I'm descended from David's line, so I can be your Messiah. You notice Joseph didn't stand up and say and call himself Messiah, even though he's descended from David's line. You know, we all want rescue from the pains of life, don't we? From the weight of sin, from the burdens we carry. We all do. I do. You do. But I think there's something in us that isn't content just to receive deliverance and then go on our merry way. We want somebody to admire. We want a supreme role model. We long both for an excellent human to learn from and imitate, but also for one far above us, worthy of worship. We long for a person in leadership we might treasure, not just put up with. We want somebody who not only gets the job done and benefits us by his actions, but also one who in himself, in his character, we might actually enjoy and admire. Doesn't that sound good? We want a king we can be proud of. If you are a disciple of Jesus Christ, you are now a monarchist. We want a king who's worthy of our fealty, one we can be proud of in the holiest of senses, one who does not make us blush with embarrassment when he speaks to the press, but one who evokes our praise. In this passage, we celebrate the coming of the King, the Messiah, the appointed heir of all things, and this Messiah did not let us down. In fact, he met our messianic expectations, and in fact, he exceeded them. Finally, after centuries of the great hope deferred, Christ came to be the great desire fulfilled. The newborn king grew up to become the supreme giant slayer who rescues people from the greatest giants of all, sin, death, and Satan. A question I think then we might ask ourselves is this: do I really welcome his reign? Or do I refuse his rule? Like, Jesus, thanks for saving me, but I got the rest of this taken care of. Hey, Jesus, you got most of my life, but you know what? I want to hold on to this part of my life. I'll relinquish this area, but this area is kind of mine. I got it covered. Or I don't want you to see what's in that box, Jesus. Maybe another year of the world's influence is ingrained in you and me, deeper patterns of longing for self-rule. I'll rule myself. I don't know where you're at. But I'll tell you this: to refuse to be ruled is to refuse the Messiah. We give him our life, all of it. You know, he didn't come to fit into our pockets. He came to win, to protect, and to own a people who are very happy, in fact, even thrilled to be in his pocket. We need a ruler on our throne. We need a champion to face the giants in our lives. His was a messianic birth. The question is, will he be your Messiah? So we've seen that it was a historic birth. We see that it was a messianic birth. Finally, we see that it was a humble birth. Look at verse 6 and 7. While they were there, the time came for her to give birth. Then she gave birth to her firstborn son, and she wrapped him tightly in cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no guest room available for them. So the time came for her to give birth, says Luke. He tells us this, and she gave birth to her firstborn. Jesus has called her firstborn son, signaling that he would have all the benefits of inheritance, reflecting all the way back to promise given to David. That's I think, another important detail suggesting that he would receive the benefits of Mary's and Joseph's royal lineage. It also indicates that she would have other children, by the way, after Jesus was born, 2 of which wrote New Testament books later on, Jude and James. We just spent some time going through the book of Jude. Bottom line here, I want to point out, though, is that Jesus was born in very humble circumstances. Here he was, the God of gods, the King of kings, born as a crying baby in a manger. And we're told that Mary wrapped him in swaddling cloths, which were pieces and strips of cloth bound together, believed to help the baby's limbs grow correctly. She did this to the Son of God because he was helpless, and he needed a mother and a father to raise him, to feed him, to look after him. That's humble. And then she laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the guest house. You know, a man went into a hotel. I heard the story about a guy going into a hotel and asked the clerk for a room. The clerk said, "Sorry, sir, but we're full. We just don't have any more rooms." And the man was taken aback a little bit because he needed a room. Goes back up to the counter. He says, "Well, can I ask you a question?" "Yeah, sure." "If the President of the United States showed up here for tonight and asked for a room, would you have one for him?" And the clerk says, "Well, yeah, of course we would." He says, "Well, good news. The President ain't coming, so I'll take his room." Here's the point of why I shared that. Because I wonder, as I was thinking about this, I wonder if the master of the home knew who Jesus really was. And if he knew who Jesus really was, would he have made room for him? I don't think he did. I don't know what he was thinking, but I do wonder about me today. I wonder about us today. Do we make room for Jesus? Do we really understand who Jesus is? He's greater than any president of the United States. He's greater than any monarch this world has ever known. Do we make room for him? Let's think about that. Back to the story. So they laid him in a manger, which, by the way, was an animal feeding trough. You can almost say that this was the first king-sized bed ever. Still, this was not a bright and beautiful night like all our Hallmark cards seem to indicate on our Christmas cards. It would have actually been quite dark and smelly and noisy and unsanitary. Yeah, the birth of the Son of God just doesn't get any humbler than that. But a question might be asked, because we talked about it already in our first point. If God is sovereign, if he is sovereign in all of this, then why didn't he have a royal palace for Jesus to be born in? I mean, he's the King of Kings after all. He's the Son of God. Why didn't he have a royal palace? After all, wasn't God clearly working behind the scenes? He was pulling the strings. He got Caesar to issue a decree. That was easy peasy for him. He was obviously ensuring that Mary and Joseph would begin dating months earlier. In fact, probably years earlier, so that they would get to this point, a specific time, a specific place. He specifically planned that Mary would be pregnant right at the right time so that she would give birth when she got there. He orchestrated the actual need for them to eventually get to Bethlehem. So why didn't God prepare a royal palace where Jesus could be born? Would have been easy for him to do. Here's why. It is because God, in his infinite wisdom, chooses the simple, ordinary things of this world to show his glory, church. God chose that manger as the place for Jesus to be born. He did that on purpose. It was part of his plan. It was a demonstration of his humility. God became a man and he took on flesh. And though he was God, he took nothing for himself. Not even an appropriate birthplace. You know what? Thank God that he chooses the ordinary and the simple. Otherwise, he would not have taken me. He would not have taken you. When you or I come to God in faith to save us from our giants, he takes us even when we're broken and in need. In fact, I would venture to say only when we're broken and when we're in need and realize our need for a Savior. Jesus came to save the brokenhearted, the ones who are lost, the ones cowering in fear because of the giants that they're facing, the ones who have issues in their lives, the ones whose lives are messed up. That is who he came for, us. That means us, church. He owns the ordinary, and he makes the ordinary amazing. That's our God. And he chose, on purpose, the humblest of entrances into our world. I think that begs a response, don't you? What should be our response? Let me just kind of wrap up a few things as we talk about our response. First of all, Jesus is born where God planned. Mary and Joseph, as I said, they're from Nazareth. That's where their home was. That's where I would assume they'd prefer that they give birth, because that's where the family was. That's where the support system was. That's where his job was. But Caesar had compelled them to go to Bethlehem. Unconcerned, by the way, that she was pregnant. He had no clue about her being pregnant. He didn't care. It was his law. Follow it. So Caesar did what he wanted to do, issue a census, and Mary did what she knew to do, which was to obey and make the best of it. But Caesar's census and Mary's obedience put them in just the right place to fulfill a 400-year-old prophecy. Isn't that amazing? Now, some of you are unsure why you're even here today, or maybe even why you're here living in the HRM. Maybe you've never planned to work for the boss you currently work for, or the job situation you're currently in, or the career you currently work in. You never planned to be in the situation, whatever situation it is that you're in today, whatever that looks like. And it may be the place you're at is a little confusing. Maybe you feel like, you know what, this doesn't feel like much favor. But you need to know that God's plan for you hasn't failed. You can trust that God is doing what he has planned to do. And church, his plan is better than yours or mine. Second of all, Jesus is born when God planned. Mary traveled 90 miles at full term. So I want you to imagine that 90 miles at full term. They weren't in a car. She didn't take a jet. She didn't take a train. And most likely she didn't even ride a donkey. They were poor. It would have cost a lot of money to get a donkey. So most likely she probably walked most of that 90 miles pregnant at full term. Imagine that. Only God could have kept that baby in her womb through that, I believe. But this baby was to be born in Bethlehem, and a premature birth just wouldn't do. And so after such a long and difficult journey, maybe even because of it, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Talk about timing. Caesar scheduled the census when he wanted to. Mary went when she had to. God's son was born when he was supposed to. Talk about timing. Caesar Augustus was such an effective ruler that he enabled the Pax Romana. Imagine 200 years of Roman peace where the entire world could be traveled with very little resistance. I think that's the perfect setting for the founding of a new global movement like Christianity, don't you think? Caesar ruled as he pleased, Mary did as she knew, and God was doing as he'd planned. Thirdly, Jesus is born to be whom God planned. So imagine, 1,000 years earlier, God had made a promise to David that he'd establish his house as a dynasty that would rule forever. Now, both Caesar and Jesus' parents, I think, make it appear as if the promise is in real peril. Caesar, by the way, is a Gentile. He's not a friend of the Jewish nation, who has what appears to be the type of authority and power that God had promised to the son of David, and yet Caesar has it. How come? How does he get it all, and yet David didn't? Especially when you look at Joseph and Mary, who are the house and lineage of David, and they're peasants paying taxes to that Gentile in power. And they have to lay their son of royal heritage in a trough for donkeys. I think they're a picture and they're evidence of how far David's dynasty has fallen, I think. It's the apparent opposite of what God said, but you know what? God specializes in the upside down kingdom of the backwards and forwards and the front and the back. Everything's different for him. You see, it was during a time of seeming opposites that God fulfilled the very promise that he had made. Listen, church, what about you? Does it feel like in your life that you're experiencing the opposite of the goodness of God? Does it feel like the harder you try to honor God, the more difficult your life becomes? You can't win for losing? No matter how hard you try, it just doesn't seem to work? Does it feel like every effort is futile? Well, I want to remind you of a single fact. Your king was born into a world that didn't even have a bed for him. The creator of the universe was born in this place, and we didn't receive him. He conquered his enemies by dying on a cross for them. Just do what you know to do and trust in the plan of God, as opposite as it seems. Whatever that might be, the surprising death of a loved one, the loss of your job, the diagnosis of a sickness, the disability of your child, that doesn't mean that God isn't at work. In fact, I would venture to tell you, encourage you, that it means that he is. And lastly, Jesus is born to do what God planned. Do you remember how the Passover celebration started? It's back in the Old Testament. Children of Israel are slaves in the land of Egypt, and Moses is trying to get them out. Pharaoh keeps saying no. Finally, this is the last of the judgments that swept across Egypt. And this was the plague that went across the land and killed every firstborn son in the land, except for those whose door had been painted with the blood of lambs. It's an amazing picture. In fact, we'll be talking a little bit about that in a moment. The blood of those lambs indicated that the firstborns of those households were just as owed death as the rest of Egypt's, but they were spared by the blood of another. The next time that we actually read about the Passover celebration, Jesus is going to be gathered around with his disciples for a Last Supper together, and he'll say, "This is my body broken for you. This is my blood poured out for you." God's firstborn son was going to lay down his life for the atonement of his people. Caesar did exactly what he wanted to do. Mary was doing all that she knew to do. But God was doing exactly what he was planning to do. And every attempt to stop him, even death on a cross, church, would serve only to further display the beauty of his plan. Isn't that beautiful? Listen, battle lines have been drawn in every one of our lives. And across that creek, across the valley, we're facing giants of our own. The giants are our indwelling sin and the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. The giants of marriage troubles or money troubles. The giants that make us feel helpless and small, that make us feel like we're out of control or angry or depressed or filled with anxiety. And maybe you feel like the oppressor has been taking ground steadily for a while now, but you need to know that these giants, who are bigger than we are, and yes, they are very intimidating, will be slain just like David's giant was. You know how they were slain? He was slain by faith in the greater David, Jesus. But sadly, he came to his own, and his own did not receive him. Church, let's not make the same mistake.